Most people looking at the opening phase of this war are entirely obsessed with the hardware. They watch the footage of B-1 Lancers cutting through Iranian airspace. They see a completely paralyzed air defense grid. They see total undisputed American aerial dominance. And they arrive at a very simple, very comforting conclusion. The United States has already won. That is exactly how amateurs analyze a conflict. Let me be absolutely clear. A massive layered air campaign can vaporize military infrastructure in a matter of hours. We have proven that, but destroying a target is not the same thing as changing a nation's behavior. Vaporizing a radar installation does not magically restructure the Middle East. And tactical annihilation, no matter how spectacular it looks on a satellite feed, does not automatically produce a controllable endgame. Today we need to look past the explosions, because the B-1 bomber is not the main story here. It is simply a symbol of a much more terrifying geopolitical question. Is absolute supremacy in the sky actually enough to win a political victory on the ground? Or did Washington just successfully destroy an army, only to plunge the world's most critical energy choke point into an uncontrollable collapse? Let's start by examining the surface reality of Operation Epic Fury. If we strip away the political rhetoric and just look at the raw kinetic data, the opening salvo was nothing short of apocalyptic for the Iranian military infrastructure. In less than 100 hours, United States and Allied forces prosecuted nearly 2,000 individual targets. We are talking about a tempo of destruction that makes the 2003 shock and awe campaign in Iraq look like a training exercise. So what did Washington actually prove in those opening days? If the battle damage assessments are even marginally accurate, the Pentagon proved three things definitively. First, they demonstrated an unparalleled ability to mobilize and project massive long-range firepower across the globe. Second, they proved they can seamlessly synchronize different strategic bomber platforms, which we will break down in a moment, in a highly volatile environment. And third, they showed they can rapidly and brutally degrade the outer shell of a sophisticated air defense and command network. But this is exactly where you have to draw a hard, unforgiving line between military capability and media sensationalism. If you turn on any mainstream news network right now, the pundits are making a massive, reckless leap in logic. They are looking at the smoking craters of Iranian radar installations and concluding that the Islamic Republic is entirely out of the fight. That is a fatal analytical error. We have to be exceptionally disciplined here. There is a vast, dangerous gulf between the statement, "The United States hit them with overwhelming force," and the assumption Iran has no capacity left to resist. Breaking an adversary's shield is not the same thing as breaking their spine. Washington successfully shattered the roof of the Iranian military machine, but the foundation of a 90 million person civilizational state does not simply crumble just because you blew the doors off the hinges. To understand why, we have to look at exactly how the United States dismantled that roof, because they didn't just throw everything at the wall. They executed a highly specific, sequenced orchestration of violence. Amateurs study weapons. Professionals study architecture. Operation Epic Fury was not a mindless, simultaneous swarm of aircraft. It was a perfectly choreographed, multi-layered sequence of violence. The sequence was the strategy. If you want to understand modern warfare, you have to look at how Washington peeled this onion. Layer 1, the B-2 spirit. This is the scalpel. It goes in first, entirely unseen, bypassing the outer radar nets. Its sole purpose is to penetrate heavily defended airspace and drop munitions capable of punching through meters of solid concrete, obliterating the deep, reinforced underground bunkers where Iran hides its most sensitive assets. Once the hardest targets are cracked open, Layer 2 begins. You send in the sledgehammer, the B-52 Stratofortress. The B-52 is not stealthy, and it doesn't pretend to be. It is an airborne freight train of destruction. Its job is to pour through the gap the B-2 created and inflict massive area denial strikes, specifically targeting the command and control network. Only then, after the radar is blind, after the missile silos are cracked, and after the command centers are bleeding, Do you unleash Layer 3, the B-1 Lancer? This is where the media gets the story completely backwards. Because of its massive payload, up to 75,000 pounds of guided and unguided munitions, the B-1 creates footage that looks absolutely spectacular on television. It creates an aura of technical and psychological supremacy. But do not misunderstand what the B-1 actually represents. The presence of the B-1 Lancer does not prove that America can fly through an intact, fully operational air defense grid. The B-1 is not a stealth aircraft. It flies uncontested into a country only after the defenses have already been systematically dismantled. The B-1 is the exploiter of a vacuum. It is the executioner that arrives to clean up the battlefield. This is the hallmark of a mature military doctrine. It is not about possessing one superweapon. It is about an ecosystem of destruction, where each platform is deployed in the exact right role, at the exact right moment, and in the exact right threat environment. So let's be entirely fair to the data. Tactically speaking, the United States has achieved a staggering level of freedom of navigation in Iranian airspace. They are operating at a tempo and depth that Iran's degraded network simply cannot counter in this opening phase. But here is the trap that Washington is walking into. Tactical air supremacy is not the same thing as regime change. Just because you own the sky does not mean you own the country. And in a moment, we are going to look at the exact mechanism the US used to paralyze the Iranian military. The destruction of its brain, and why paralyzing a brain does not necessarily kill the body. To understand why the opening days of epic fury look so one-sided, you have to understand the anatomy of a modern military. A military is not just a collection of tanks, fighter jets, and missile silos. It is a biological organism. It requires a brain to process threats and a nervous system to tell the muscles when to strike. In military terms, that nervous system is called command and control, or C2. When the United States sent B-52s to carpet bomb the IRGC Joint Headquarters and Aerospace Command Centers, they weren't just destroying buildings. They were performing a strategic decapitation. This is the most critical takeaway from the tactical layer. Destroying a C2 node is infinitely more valuable than destroying a single missile launcher. When a military loses its command and control network, it doesn't just lose its radar feeds, it loses the ability to authorize fire. It loses the ability to coordinate different branches of the armed forces. The Air Force cannot talk to the Navy, and the missile battalions cannot receive targeting coordinates. The entire system fractures into isolated blind units, acting on instinct rather than strategy. But, and this is a massive but, we must not fall into the trap of assuming that a lobotomized military is a dead military. Losing your C2 infrastructure degrades the quality of your response. It severely hampers your ability to launch massive synchronized salvos. But it does not mean your weapons simply evaporate. The muscles are still there. The state still possesses massive destructive capability. If the brain can no longer connect to the fist, the military efficiency collapses. But in an asymmetrical war, a blind, flailing fist can still cause catastrophic damage to the global economy. And that brings us to the most fragile vulnerability of the entire American campaign. A vulnerability that had nothing to do with Iranian missiles and everything to do with American allies. We like to think of air power as something that exists purely in the sky, an omnipotent force raining down from the heavens. The reality is far more grounded. Air supremacy is completely tethered to the dirt. It is dictated by runways, fuel tankers, maintenance crews, and most importantly, the political will of your allies. Let's look at the B-1 Lancer strikes again. Why did the United States fly 3 B-1 bombers on a grueling 30-hour round trip from the American Midwest, requiring massive mid-air refueling operations, just to drop their payload? Why didn't they stage out of RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom or the island base of Diego Garcia, two American-funded NATO-aligned facilities, specifically built for exactly this scenario? Because the British government initially said no. This is not a minor logistical footnote. This is the absolute spine of geopolitical strategy. in the opening hours of the most significant U.S. military operation in a generation. One of Washington's oldest and closest allies looked at the escalatory risk of bombing Iran, and they refused to absorb that risk. They locked the gates. It proves a brutal rule of the multipolar world. Alliances are not automated. Allies are actors with their own survival instincts, and they do not want to be dragged into a regional catastrophe just because Washington decided to pull the trigger. So what changed London's mind? Iran made a fatal strategic error. They launched a strike that hit a UK military base in Cyprus. The moment Iranian munitions touched British soil, the political calculus in London flipped. They had been dragged into the blast radius. The very next day, Prime Minister Starmer reversed course. RAF Fairford was opened. Within a week, 60% of America's mission-capable B-1 fleet was sitting on a tarmac just 60 minutes away from Iranian airspace, reducing a 30-hour logistical nightmare into a rapid-fire assembly line of destruction. The United States solved its logistics problem, but they only solved it because Iran handed them the political justification on a silver platter. But what happens now? What happens when a regime realizes its conventional military is being systematically dismantled from the sky, its command structure is shattered, and it has absolutely no way to shoot down the bombers? It stops trying to fight the bombers, and it starts aiming at the one thing Washington cannot afford to lose. Let's address the most dangerous hallucination in Washington right now. There is an assumption, a deeply flawed, historically illiterate assumption, that if you blow up enough radars and sink enough ships, the targeted regime will simply raise a white flag, collapse, and be replaced by a compliant, pro-Western democracy. They are equating air supremacy with regime change. Let me be absolutely clear. Controlling the sky over Tehran does not mean you control Tehran. You must ruthlessly separate two distinct questions. Question 1. Can the United States severely degrade Iran's conventional military? Yes, the B-1 bombers just proved that. But question 2. Does that degradation automatically trigger the collapse of the Iranian state? Absolutely not. History is littered with the graves of empires that confuse military destruction with political control. You can vaporize a surface-to-air missile site from 30,000 feet, but that does not erase the internal security apparatus of a 90 million person civilizational state. The regime may lose its fighter jets, but it still controls the police, the paramilitaries, and the food supply. Furthermore, massive external bombardment rarely empowers the domestic opposition. More often than not, it triggers a siege mentality. It forces a fractured society to rally around a brutal state out of pure primal survival instinct. Air supremacy is not regime change. It is simply the destruction of the outer perimeter. And when you strip away the conventional weapons of a desperate, cornered state, they do not surrender, they mutate. If you are the Iranian High Command and you know you cannot shoot down an American B-1 Lancer, what do? You stop trying to fight an American war, and you force Washington to fight an Iranian one. The media looks at the smoking craters of Iran's conventional military and assumes Tehran has no leverage left. That is entirely backwards. A state does not need air supremacy to inflict catastrophic, unacceptable costs on the global system. Iran is shifting to asymmetric warfare 2.0. They are pivoting to the levers they still control. We are talking about cyber attacks designed to cripple regional banking sectors. We are talking about the activation of proxy networks stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, designed to bleed American forces in 1,000 tiny, unresolvable skirmishes. But most importantly, they are pivoting to the sea. You do not need a multi-billion-dollar navy to shut down commercial shipping. A swarm of $5,000 explosive sea drones and a handful of legacy anti-ship mines can make maritime insurance premiums so astronomically high that not a single commercial captain will sail through the region. And that is exactly where the American tactical victory begins to trigger a global strategic collapse. Welcome to the absolute center of gravity for the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through this specific, narrow strip of water. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, primarily from Qatar, flows through here. When Washington decided to launch Operation Epic Fury, they essentially lit a match inside a global gas station. Look at the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. In the Western media, they are treated as mere spectators or simply as parking lots for American fighter jets. In reality, they are terrified hostages. These nations want Iran's nuclear ambitions contained. Yes, but they absolutely do not want a catastrophic regime collapse in Tehran. Why? Because if the Iranian state shatters, it doesn't just quietly disappear. It turns into a 1.6 million square kilometer power vacuum. It means millions of refugees flooding the borders. It means heavily armed, uncontrolled militias operating right on their doorsteps. And right now, because Iran cannot reach the American homeland, they are turning their remaining arsenal against their neighbors. Iran is explicitly telling the Gulf states, if our oil cannot flow, your oil will burn. If our regime falls, we are dragging your glass tower economies down into the abyss with us. When a conflict touches the Strait of Hormuz, the rules of geopolitics change completely. This ceases to be a bilateral war between Washington and Tehran. It becomes a war against the global supply chain. The American bombers may have cleared the skies, but they have pushed the global energy market to the absolute brink of a heart attack. Which brings us to the ultimate question. If Iran is losing all its hardware, but still refuses to capitulate, what does winning actually look like for them? You might be surprised to learn that in the minds of the Ayatollahs, they don't actually need to defeat the United States military to win this war. They just need to outlast American patience. What does winning actually look like for a nation whose conventional military is being erased from the sky? If you view warfare through a traditional Western symmetrical lens, Iran is losing disastrously. But if you view this through the lens of asymmetric warfare, the calculus completely flips. In an asymmetric conflict, the weaker power does not need to defeat the stronger power's military. They do not need to shoot down B-1 bombers. They only need to do one thing: deny the stronger power its political objective. Washington's stated political objective is regime change from within, and the stabilization of the region. Therefore, Iran's victory condition is brutally simple: survive politically and make the region as unstable and unlivable as possible. They don't need to win a pitched battle. They just need to make the cost of the war measured in global inflation, skyrocketing maritime insurance, and a terrified oil market so unbelievably toxic that the international community and America's own allies force Washington to stop the bombing. If the Iranian regime is still breathing when the smoke clears, even if they are ruling over a mountain of rubble, they win, because they survive the absolute apex of American military power. And that brings us to the ultimate paradox of Operation Epic Fury. If you take only one concept away from this entire analysis, let it be this: the opening phase of this campaign was a breathtaking demonstration of American reach. Washington proved it can project apocalyptic firepower across 7,000 miles. It proved it can coordinate stealth bombers, heavy payload carriers, and mid-air logistics with terrifying precision. It proved it can dismantle the hard infrastructure of a hostile nation in less than 100 hours. But geopolitical dominance is not about reach. It is about control. The campaign has proven American reach. It has not yet proven American control. Can Washington control the political succession if the Ayatollahs fall? Can Washington control the millions of refugees that will pour into Turkey and Europe? Can Washington control the proxy militias in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen when their central command structure is severed and they go fully rogue? Most importantly, can Washington control the panic in the global energy markets when a 90 million person state descends into absolute anarchy right next to the Strait of Hormuz? Air power is seductive because it is clean. It happens at 30,000 feet. You drop a JDAM, a radar installation disappears, and you return to base. It creates the illusion that war is a math problem that can be solved with explosives. But bombs cannot solve political legitimacy. They cannot govern fractured societies, and a B-1 Lancer, for all its magnificent engineering, cannot stop a desperate teenager in a fiberglass speedboat from dropping a $500 naval mine into a shipping lane and halting 20% of the world's natural gas supply. The United States has mastered the clean part of the war, but they have just triggered the messy part. Now, as analysts, we must constantly stress test our own models. What could prove this grim forecast wrong? What are the blind spots in assuming this spirals into an uncontrollable geopolitical mess? First, the intelligence. It is entirely possible that the battle damage assessments we are receiving are highly sanitized or exaggerated. Iran has a long history of deeply burying, dispersing, and hiding its core assets. The degradation of their missile force might be slower than the Pentagon claims. Second, the political endgame. It is possible that Washington is not actually seeking true regime change. Despite the public rhetoric, the deep state objective might simply be coercive degradation, smashing Iran's military to set them back 20 years, and then quietly stepping away before the state actually collapses. And third, we cannot underestimate the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and the UAE possess immense financial and diplomatic leverage. They might force both Washington and Tehran into a backdoor off-ramp simply because they cannot afford the economic suicide of a closed Persian Gulf. We must hold these possibilities in our minds, but we must also prepare for the trajectory we are currently on. So let's bring this all together. If the operational reports of the last 2 weeks are even marginally accurate, the United States has just delivered an absolute masterclass in kinetic destruction. They have executed a multi-layered, flawlessly sequenced air campaign. They have paralyzed the nervous system of a major regional power, and they have secured a level of aerial dominance over Iran that military planners dream about. They have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they can dismantle the machine. But as we have established today, destroying the machine is the easy part. An air campaign is the cleanest, most predictable phase of any modern conflict. The hardest part, the truly terrifying part, is what begins the exact moment the bombers return to base. Does this unprecedented display of firepower actually lead to a formal surrender? Does it trigger the controlled pro-Western regime change that Washington is banking on? Or have we simply set the stage for a much darker, much more chaotic era of asymmetric warfare, where proxy militias run wild, state structures collapse, and the global energy market becomes a permanent battlefield? Here is your final lesson for today. In modern warfare, it is remarkably easy for a superpower to prove that it can destroy an adversary. It is infinitely more difficult to prove that it can control what emerges from the ashes. The tactical victory is secured. The strategic nightmare is just beginning. Thank you for attending today's session. If you want to understand the geopolitical forces that are actually shaping our world, and if you want to see through the fog of war long before these events hit the mainstream headlines, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't let yourself be blinded by the surface picture. Stay sharp, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next lecture.